Hey everyone! OMG Tarot here, and you're listening to the OMG Tarot podcast. Today, it's all about the horses of tarot. You knew it was coming up soon. There are 7 depictions of horses in the Rider Waite Smith deck, and there's so much symbolism embedded in them that trying to fit them into the animals episode would have made that episode extremely long. So it just made sense to give them their own episode. Now, of course, certain other decks have more depictions of horses. One in particular I can think of is the Morgan Greer deck, where instead of having sphinxes pull the chariot, he's got a black horse and a white horse. Just like in every other episode of the OMG Tarot podcast, we're going to be focused on the Rider Waite Smith deck today, and just kind of looking forward. I'm not sure this is going to be the case forever. There are a lot of really excellent decks out there, and some of the ideas I have for future episodes aren't really locked into the symbolism of one deck or another. They're going to be more about you as a reader versus the cards themselves. And I think it's fun and interesting to bust out of the Rider Waite Smith system. It's a great foundation for lots of other decks that have came after, but it's not the only tarot deck out here, and it's not the only way to interpret the symbols that are in these 78 cards. Think back to the episode with Benedicta. She works with the Hermetic deck. I might even do an episode about the Hermetic deck and the Thoth deck, which is very closely related to it, and talking about how, and more importantly, why it differs from the Rider Waite Smith deck. We're actually also going to get into that in a very closely upcoming episode, so stay tuned. And of course, I reference Marseille decks somewhat regularly on this show. That's not going to change, and in fact, podcasting has actually kind of made me appreciate Marseille decks even more. I think I've said that before, but if I haven't, it has. But the reason why I emphasize the Rider Waite Smith deck in this podcast, and even if it might become a little less frequent in the future, it's not totally going to go away, is because it's a deck that most, or maybe even all of us, have seen before. It's the stereotypical archetypal tarot deck. It's the one that most people start out with, myself included. And by having that as a common frame of reference, it's very easy for me to refer to specific cards and have you all know exactly what I'm referring to, whether that means flipping through your deck to find a card or just pulling it up in your mind's eye. Like, for example, if I say the sun, you're going to know that I'm talking about that card with the gray pony, the naked baby, the somber looking sun, the sunflowers, the red banner, that gray wall that looks like Belgian blocks. What's it made of? I don't know. And sometimes when you're getting acquainted with a new deck, being able to cross reference your new deck with a Rider Waite Smith deck can be an interesting way to see what did that artist choose to emphasize, where did they try to deviate from the original illustration, and also then assess for yourself how successful were they. Not all decks are created equally. There are some absolutely wonderful, richly symbolic other decks on the market, and some that kind of feel like they took the Rider Waite Smith, they kind of slapped on a popular franchise and called it a day and sold it at Barnes& and Noble. So let's dive into the horses that are in your Rider Waite Smith deck. As I mentioned, there are 7 of them. There's one for each of the knights, there's one on death, there's one on the sun, and there's one on the 6 of Wands. Each horse brings something unique to its card, but broadly, we can read the horses as symbolic of forward momentum and progress. And keep in mind, this isn't always toward a specific stated goal. Sometimes the horse symbolizes progress away from something. After all, riding a horse is all about movement, and you move in all different directions. You don't just only go toward things, sometimes you go away from things, and sometimes you're riding simply to explore. Maybe it's a reconnaissance mission, and the whole point is just to observe your environment and learn and figure out what's around you. So, in any case, that's what we're dealing with when we look at the horses. It's progress and momentum and movement. To get a little more information out of the horses, take a look at which direction they're all facing. As I've mentioned before, typically the right hand is understood to be the giving hand, and the left hand is understood to be the receiving hand. Some readers take this a step further and interpret which way a figure on a tarot card is facing to determine are they primarily giving their energy or are they primarily receiving the energy that their card symbolizes. I don't necessarily do things that way, but I do think it's an interesting thought experiment, especially when we apply it to the horses. And just as a side note, for me, the way each figure is facing factors more so into the tarot card spread as a whole. So I'm looking at if a figure is facing right, what is on their right? What are they looking at over there? Which typically the answer is another card. So if I have, say, someone facing to the right and over on the right is justice, I would say I'd read that in the context of that figure is looking over at justice and all that that card symbolizes. So just a side note from me, you might read that way, you might not, but it's always served me very well. And if you haven't tried it, it might be worthwhile to just give that style reading a shot and see if it resonates with you. So, looking at our Rider Waite Smith deck, we have 5 horses that are facing to the right and 2 that are facing to the left. Now, you could make the argument that the horse on the sun is more so kind of diagonal and kind of facing to the front with a slight rightward twist. So, alright, but I'm sticking it in the right hand category because it's definitely not facing to the left. The other horses that are facing to the right are Death, the Knight of Pentacles, the Knight of Cups, and the Six of Wands. That leaves the Knight of Swords and the Knight of Wands as our 2 knights who are looking leftward. And so let's chew on that idea of these 2 being our receptive knights versus our projective knights, because when you take a look at the Knight of Wands and the Knight of Swords, they really both look like they're, whatever it is they're serving up, they are serving, they're giving it. They don't look like particularly passive receptive individuals here. We have our Knight of Wands on his bright red horse who's bucking up and raring as the knight seems to be commanding him to charge forward. And then we have the Knight of Swords whose horse is kind of looking back at him like, are you sure about this? Do you really want me to charge forward? And that Knight of Swords seems even more hell-bent on charge! So we can back up and look at them by their elements. Our Knight of Swords is the knight who's all about information and understanding, and our Knight of Wands is all about passion and drive. So what are these knights receiving as they seem to be pushing toward that? Maybe that Knight of Swords is so hell-bent on understanding and getting all the information that he's aggressively receptive, almost like I'm going to listen to every podcast and I'm going to read every book and I'm going to know everything. Basically, someone who decides that they want to become an expert in their latest interest overnight, so they just go down that rabbit hole. And then when you see a faint glow coming from their office at 3 a.m., you walk in and you're like, what are you doing? And they're like so many clicks deep in a Wikipedia rabbit hole. I think this interpretation makes sense given what we know about knights, because knights are essentially teenager energy. They're in the driver's seat of their own lives for the very first time, and they don't yet have the maturity to necessarily modulate their actions. It's all or nothing with a knight because their brain is still developing. It's kind of understandable why they go hard or go home. But is the Knight of Swords a voracious consumer of information, or is he a know-it-all who wants to, well, actually, everyone, and dominate the conversation? I've always kind of thought of him as the latter, but I can see how both exist, and I can see how the first feeds the second. So that's my interpretation if I were to work with that idea of he's facing left because he's more of a receiver than a giver. Now let's take a look at our Knight of Wands, our other receptive knight. Similar to the Knight of Swords, he is a voracious consumer, but unlike the Knight of Swords, who's all about wanting to know everything and wanting to be the smartest person in the room, our Knight of Wands is an adventurer. He's a wild child. He's consuming experiences. This is the guy who you go on vacation with him and you don't relax for a second. You need to relax after the vacation because you spent every single day ziplining and hiking and bungee jumping and recording like 20,000 steps per day. Similarly, is this knight one who tries to dominate the room by pushing his will forward and just kind of expressing that ego all day? Or is he looking to receive as many experiences and do as many actions as possible? Maybe we can read both into it. Moving on to all the other horses, they're all facing to the right. So I talked a little bit about the sun. I'm going to revisit the sun in a moment. Let's actually start with our Knight of Cups, because I've always felt If anyone were the receptive knight, it would be the Knight of Cups, because the Knight of Cups is the one who's watery and emotional and flowy, so he's the one who wants to hear what you're feeling and wants to understand and experience the world through all of his senses. He's the poet. I've always read the Knight of Cups as a poet and a beautiful soul. If we want to look at this through that left right paradigm, maybe we'd read him as expressing those emotions and as that poetic knight sharing his poetry and his inner thoughts with the world. Maybe that's the way that our Knight of Cups is projective and giving. He's giving emotional depth to the things and the people around him. Similarly, our Knight of Pentacles, he gives stability. You could also read him as an investor. I often have, because the Pentacles are all about what's the wealth and the abundance that you're building. So I've read him as carefully, thoughtfully researching his investment options and taking the time to make sure he invests at regular intervals. Taking a look at him as a whole, he's the calmest knight. His horse is at a standstill and he's looking over the horizon. This is the slow-moving, disciplined knight. That's a real contrast to our Knight of Wands and our Knight of Swords, right? So maybe we could say that he's giving that stability to the things he's investing in. Maybe he's putting in the work and putting in the support structures where they need to be in order to keep on building down the line. Maybe this is literally him putting money in investment accounts every single month. He's not yet at the stage that the queen or the king would be, where everything is paying off, especially that queen, because queens are receptive and magnetic. So perhaps the investments that one makes at the knight stage then pay off once they reach the queen stage. Our other horses are Death, the Sun, and the Six of Wands. I think if we want to think in terms of left and right and giving, receiving, Death's is kind of obvious. Death is bringing that ending that needs to happen. Similarly, you might say that Six of Wands is bringing that sense of achievement and that sense of victory that we're going to get into a little bit more. But first, let's take a look at the Sun, because this one is the one that's kind of going diagonally, but we can again say maybe this is bringing in and stating a claim to that lack of inhibition and that sense of freedom and creativity that the Sun card is. There's a lot to read into the backgrounds on these cards, but we're not getting into those today. We're looking at the horses themselves. In the Rider Waite Smith deck, every single horse has a rider. And as I've mentioned, you can read the horses as vehicles for forward momentum. You can also, as many readers do, read the horses as complementary to their riders. So you might read the horse as the emotional, introspective inner world, and the rider as the projective outer world that faces the public. Think of them like yin and yang. The rider is the yang, the rider is the expansive, big, active half, and the horse is yin. It's the inner half, the one that looks inward and retracts. Readers who follow this typically then read the horse as expressing what the rider might really feel inside, that maybe the horse's expression is showing the rider's true emotional state, the state that they might feel that they can't express to the world. So let's take a look at some of these horses' body language. I've always really loved the expression on the horse on the Six of Wands because, well, look at it. It's giving so much side-eye. It's marching forward past all of those people who are holding up wands, but its head is facing you, the viewer, and it kind of looks like it's over this. The Six of Wands is all about a sense of achievement. Things are going right, at least for now, after that struggle that was the Five of Wands. So now, dropping it into this context, that rider does look pretty proud, and it makes sense because this rider was victorious and overcame that struggle. So he's looking over at the crowd, connecting with them, but his horse is telling kind of a different story. Is that horse expressing the cockiness and maybe even contempt that the rider feels he can't express publicly? Remember, the wands are ego-driven. This horse is also covered up by a large garment that obscures its legs and torso. What, if anything, is hidden underneath? Motives? Goals? Maybe this one's not an actual horse, but a couple of people in a horse costume. I honestly think it's a real horse. But perhaps the rider has a few secrets up his sleeve, and we can interpret this by how covered up his horse is. In contrast, there's one completely nude horse in the deck, the sun. Often, readers interpret this horse's lack of a saddle, bridle, and reins as a lack of restrictions and inhibitions. I think this horse's expression is really interesting. We've got the rider, a naked baby, who's wearing a relaxed, open facial expression. The baby's not holding onto the horse in any way, he's just waving his hands out, enjoying the ride. The horse, on the other hand, looks weary. This horse always kind of reminded me of Eeyore. So why isn't the horse as cheerful as the baby? Well, let's think about the sun card. Following up after the moon, it carries the sense of emerging from a dark place. You're lighter, you're freer, you understand yourself better because you went through those difficulties and darkness that was in the moon card. And now, you're not burdened by a ton of heavy baggage. So why does the horse look like it is burdened? There are a lot of different ways you can answer that, and I implore you to really sit and think and reflect on this to find the interpretation that makes the most sense to you. My personal interpretation is that although this baby has emerged renewed and refreshed and able to express themselves totally after going through that darkness of the moon, somewhere deep inside, they're never going to forget the things that they reflected on during that. And also, because this is number 19 in the Major Arcana, they're not going to forget all of those lessons that they learned leading up to this. I know in a lot of the Major Arcana deep dive episodes, I talked about how the cards flow into each other and how the lessons stack on each other. And I think that this horse on the sun is a really good example of how all of those things, those experiences that you have, just stack and become lessons and shape how you view the world and how you conduct yourself. I've become kind of fond of the word schema lately, and I think that all those major arcana experiences shape your schema, and I think that's what we're seeing in this very weary, beleaguered horse, that although the baby might feel fresh and renewed, that's just the ego, that's just the outer facing part. The inner part knows what they've been through. And good, that's the point. You're supposed to internalize these lessons and learn from them and grow from them. And I think the horse is just communicating, yeah, I've seen it. I've been through it. Oh boy. Because they're also almost at the end of the cycle here. We've only got 2 more cards to go. Looking at the knight's horse's facial expressions, we can also find some clues as to what are the inner workings of these knights and what are they thinking and feeling, but not necessarily saying. I think perhaps the most expressive and interesting one is the horse that's on the Knight of Swords, because this horse looks terrified. Look at it. The horse's pupil is gazing back at its rider, and its ears are down flat. This horse is terrified as it charges forward. It's in a full gallop, but this horse doesn't necessarily look like he wants to be galloping at the speed he's galloping. It looks like he's just following along with what the knight is telling him to do. Maybe, while this knight thinks he's the smartest guy in the room and or is voraciously consuming all the information he possibly can, maybe he's a little bit afraid that he's going too fast and going too far. Maybe there's a sense of imposter syndrome in him. I think it's interesting that there's no water on this card whatsoever. That means that there's no apparent emotions, except take a look at the little charm on the horse's bridle. That looks like a heart to me. Could this heart symbolize a wee bit of emotional intelligence in the knight that perhaps the knight doesn't necessarily want to acknowledge because he's just trying to be right all the time? But just because he doesn't want to acknowledge it doesn't mean it's not there. And sticking it on the horse can show that it's deep down inside this knight and it's still operating in the background and it's still, even if it's in kind of the depths of his mind, it's there. And maybe some of the horse's apprehension is coming from this. Maybe the horse first recognizes we can't be smart without having a full spectrum of intelligence. You can't just prattle off facts. You have to have an emotional intelligence too. Moving over to our Knight of Wands, this horse looks a lot more comfortable with what his rider is doing. This horse may be bucking up, rearing, and doing that thing on his hind legs, but this horse at least looks willing to go along with what the rider wants. This horse is confident and bold, just like the Knight of Wands. But also take a look at how the knight is gripping that horse's reins really, really tight and pulling its head back. Is the Knight of Wands inhibiting his horse? Could there be a tiny sense of fear in this knight? Maybe he is a little worried about how far is too far. How far can I push myself? How far should I push myself? He's fiery and he's driven and he's passionate, but he's also marching into uncharted territory. Maybe he's not quite sure where the limits are, so this really tight grip on the horse is some sense of pulling back before he goes so far that he wrecks himself. Then there's the facial expression on the Knight of Pentacles' horse. This horse has such a calm look about him. This horse is standing calmly, at a standstill as I've mentioned, and surveying the horizon along with his knight. This is also the only black horse in the deck. I'm not sure if the colors matter. They probably do. Our Knight of Wands has his bright rust-colored horse, and all the other horses are some shade of white to gray, with this starkly contrasting black horse, but I'm not sure that there's any official answer as to why the horses are the colors they are. We can read into the Knight of Wands' horse that he's red because he's bold and passionate. So maybe the Knight of Pentacles' horse, the black, is all about looking inward and introspection. I'm only pulling this out because elsewhere in the deck, such as on the Chariot and on the Wheel of Fortune, we see black and white together to be that yin-yang symbol, the sense of expansion versus introspection. And this Knight of Pentacles' horse is just straight up black with some white highlights to show where the sun is hitting his mane and various points on his body, so maybe he's just a very introspective, looking inward, reflective horse. Maybe this horse is the Knight of Pentacles' inner sense to look inward and think about, what am I building? What do I really want? What do I really need through all my pentacly activities, such as investing, building, staking my claim in the ground? With all 4 feet on the ground, this horse is on solid footing, and by extension, so is his rider. Which also, now that I'm looking a bit more closely at this card, the Knight of Pentacles has the most comfortable looking saddle out of the 4 knights. Take a look at that. He's got this like little backrest in the back. If I was going to ride on any of these horses, I think I'm picking the Knight of Pentacles as horse. He's also got behind the saddle what looks like maybe a saddle pad or maybe some saddle bags. As you can tell, I'm not an equestrian, but there's definitely a lot more going on this horse, and it would make sense to me that of all the knights to have saddlebags filled up with supplies, it would be the Knight of Pentacles, because he's the planner, the disciplined one, the one who has access to the material items. So again, that's just another point toward, if I'm riding any of these horses, I'm riding this Knight of Pentacles horse. I think that out of the 4 horses with knights, this horse seems to be the most in tune with what his rider is doing. As I mentioned, they're both scanning the horizon. There isn't any dissonance between what the rider appears to be thinking and feeling and what the horse appears to be thinking and feeling. They're both grounded. They're both secure. And they both have plants growing out of their headwear. If you look up at the knight, he's got some greenery coming out of his helmet. And then on the horse, right on the front of his bridle, he's got very similar looking greenery. So, as we talked about last week, plants and leaves and flowers, anything that's from the plant world on a tarot card, symbolizes growth and abundance, and that's literally what these guys are doing. They're the Pentacles guys, so of course they've got growth and abundance worked into their design. And then that brings us to our last knight, the Knight of Cups. I chose to talk about the Knight of Cups last because we also haven't talked about Death, and a lot of people draw comparisons between Death and the Knight of Cups. I alluded to this in a couple of early episodes, namely the episode about Death and the episode about the Knights, so if you haven't listened to those, go back and give them a listen. I didn't really do a super deep dive into this connection there because it felt like it needed its own topic, and I think that now is the time to dive into that topic. But first, let's take a look at the Knight of Cups' horse. His horse has one leg lifted, and it's looking downward toward that flowing river that's right in front of them. The knight, in contrast, is not. He's looking right ahead. In fact, his facial expression is very similar to the facial expression on the Knight of Pentacles. This horse's head is being slightly pulled back by its rider, but his grip doesn't appear to be as tight as the Knight of Wands' grip. The Knight of Wands is really pulling his horse's head back, versus this guy, it looks like the rider is controlling the horse and guiding it with the reins, but not so tightly. This horse looks like he's got some more freedom to move, and that makes a whole lot of sense in context of he's the watery horse. This is the emotional one. This is the one who earlier I said I've always read as the poet. Perhaps if our right-facing rider is looking out and sharing his emotions and projecting them onto the world, his horse, whose gaze is downward at that river, is how he's developing these feelings. It's his intuitive side and his perceptive side. This horse is that inner, sensitive, creative soul that makes the rider able to communicate so eloquently. Also, this horse is a little plain compared to the other knight's horses. There aren't a whole lot of decorations on his bridle, saddle, and reins like there are on the other guys, and he's lacking saddlebags. He just has a very simple saddle and a very simple bridle and rein setup. Maybe he doesn't need to have a whole lot put upon him. Maybe he's able to just exist as he is in his relatively natural state. And I say relatively natural because he's still got some outfitting on. He's not like the horse on the sun who's completely without any sort of reins or anything like that. But now let's get into that comparison between the Knight of Cups and Death, because I've heard a lot of other readers say that Death is supposed to be the Knight of Cups after he's died. People say that Death and the Knight of Cups mirror each other, but I just don't necessarily see it. I think that, obviously, both cases, the horse is standing with one leg up, curled as if he is mid-step, but that's it. Death's horse is holding its head high versus the Knight of Cups. His horse is reaching down with its head and looking downward toward the ground. Both riders are sitting up tall, sure, but while the Knight of Cups is looking directly forward, Death is turned slightly to make eye contact with the viewer. In fact, if we really want to look for some comparisons, why isn't Death the Knight of Wands after he died? If you take a look at what he's wearing, he's got that red feather on his helmet just like the Knight of Wands has. If he's the Knight of Cups, did he change outfits between life and death? I'm open-minded and willing to consider different perspectives, and however you interpret Death is up to you. It's very personal, but for me, this one just never sat right with me. I've always seen Death as being completely separate from the Knight, even though he's dressed up like a knight. I get it, but I just don't think he's one of these knights after death, and I think the comparisons with the Knight of Cups are kind of loose. There's just not enough evidence there for me to really get on board with, oh yes, obviously he's modeled on the Knight of Cups. Because also, let's bring back that idea of left and right, giving and receiving. Each of these knights has an accessory. Our Knight of Cups has his big cup, and Death has that flag with the Tudor rose on it. They're in separate hands. Our Knight of Cups has the chalice in his right hand. He's giving the emotion. He's projecting that out into the world. Versus Death's flag is over in its left hand. Death is receiving peace. Death receives that cleansing and purification that comes from having to cull what's not working anymore. But let's not get too into the weeds about the riders, because this episode's about the horses, not about them. Death's horse. Oh boy! Death's horse is stark white with a solid red eyeball. This horse doesn't even have pupils, it's just a pupilless red eye. Is this horse even alive? I mean, it is the horse on the death card, so if any of these horses are dead, it would be this one. While its rider is turned and making eye contact with the viewer, the horse's gaze is straight on, marching forward in almost a robotic fashion. This horse doesn't stop for anybody, and in fact, this horse is carefully stepping over a king whose crown is now strewn on the ground and walking directly toward those kids and the priest who seems to be trying to communicate with Death and perhaps even plead, but can Death hear him? And the horse? Death stops for nobody and continues to march forward. So that about wraps our discussion about the horses for today. I hope you learned something, and if you interpret the horses differently or you want to talk about something that I didn't cover in this podcast, shoot me a DM, shoot me an email. I love connecting with other readers and tarot enthusiasts, so if you want to know where to find me, head over to omgtarot.com. That's my website, and you can fill out a form there to get in touch, or just shoot me an email, omg@omgtarot.com, or Instagram, which I spend way too much time on each day, so I'll catch your DM. My handle is its_omg_tarot. If you like what you heard, leave me a review. And or subscribe if you're not subscribed yet. Subscribe on Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts, and you'll be notified every single time a new episode of OMG Tarot drops. Other than that, thanks for hanging, and see you next week. Bye-bye.